Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Dr. Anthony Smith, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Dayton, and the Chair of the Program Committee of the American Catholic Historical Association. The ACHA was founded in 1919 as an organization dedicated to the study of the history of Catholicism in its many facets. Over the past century, it has grown and developed and become a place that we like to think of as the place where Catholic studies begins. Because of COVID, we were not able to gather and meet for our annual conference earlier this year. So instead, we decided to program a series of webinar events that highlights just some of the work that our members are doing. Our first webinar was in October, and tonight is our second one. And the topic is Masculinities, Catholic Style, a subject that has not received nearly as enough attention that it deserves. And so tonight's going to be a very special evening for some really good conversation, analysis, and interpretation of Catholicism in the context of gender and masculinities. Before we get started, I just want to make a few brief announcements. First, if you're enjoying tonight and our webinars, I'd invite you to consider joining us, the American Catholic Historical Association. You can do that by going to our website, achahistory.org. The association does a lot of great work, and it publishes a quarterly journal that includes scholarly journal articles on many facets of the history of Catholicism. We have a spring meeting, and we also have, as I indicated, an annual conference at the beginning of January in conjunction with the the American Historical Association. In that regard, let me just briefly mention that the ACHA is holding its next in-person annual conference in January 2022, so a year from now. It'll be held in New Orleans. And the call for papers for that conference has just been announced. You can find it at our website, achahistory.org. So I encourage you to consider submitting a proposal for a paper, a panel, or a roundtable, such as tonight's event was originally intended to be a roundtable at our conference in Seattle, which had to be canceled because of COVID. In addition, we have two more webinars this winter to look forward to. Our next webinar is entitled Teaching Outside Your Specialization in a Time of Disciplinary Retrenchment. That will be held 2 weeks from tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, Wednesday, February 10th. That will prove to be a valuable discussion regarding about teaching in contemporary higher education. Then a month later at 7 p.m., again, Eastern Time, on Tuesday, March 10th, we'll conclude our webinar series with an international panel of scholars addressing the opening of the Pius XII archives and Holocaust research. That will be a very special and important event. Again, that takes place March 10th, Tuesday at 7 p.m. All these webinars, like tonight's, are free, but we ask that you register beforehand. And with that, I will turn the rest of the evening over to our panelists. Lloyd?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the Studying Masculinities, Catholic Style, a roundtable. So today we have a group of distinguished panelists who will be speaking to us for a couple of minutes each. But to just kind of, frame the conversation, I want to start off with a couple of prefatory remarks. So the study of Catholicism has been deepened and challenged by a focus on women and feminisms over the past 20 years. The focus on, among many, women's devotional practices, women's leadership as Catholic sisters, and lay women's activism has made us rethink the boundaries of what counts as Catholic and who defines the terms of Catholic subjectivity. Behind these interventions has been a critique of the hidden assumption of a male Catholic subject. The critical study of Catholic masculinities brings these interventions full circle. In this roundtable today, each panelist asks, what happens to Catholic studies when we remember that male is a gender too? Our format here is a series of brief provocations intended to spark discussion. We look forward to your thoughts and your questions in the Q&A function here in the Zoom platform. Okay, so our panelists, they will be presenting in alphabetical order according to their surname. So first we'll have William S. Cosson, followed by Catherine Dugan, Next, Amy Kollinger, followed by Alyssa Maldonado Estrada, followed by Jean Petit, and last, John Seitz. So as I mentioned, our first panelist is William S. Cosson. And to give the formal sort of introduction here, William S. Cosson is a historian of American religion and nationalism. His first book, Making Catholic America, Religious Nationalism in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, is forthcoming from Cornell University Press. All right, William, floor is yours.
Thank you, Lloyd, and also thank you to the ACHA for hosting us and Kate for organizing this panel. So the provocation, I titled it originally Manly Sacraments and Masculine Devotions, Catholic Manhood in the Civil War. What should it mean to historians that so much of what we think of as Catholic masculinity has not only been influenced by Catholic women, but has been actively formed and shaped by them? To begin seeking an answer to this question, I'd like to focus on Catholic soldiers, both Northern and Southern, in the American Civil War. While the ethnic and nationalist dimensions of Civil War Catholicism have been the subjects of much research in Catholic studies, the topic of Catholic gender is not. To be sure, there's been excellent work on the heroic efforts of women religious as nurses and on the dozens of priests who serve as chaplains on battlefields and in camps. But what has been lacking in these studies is an exploration of how the war shaped Catholic soldiers as men. Additionally, because research on the everyday lived religion of Catholic soldiers has also been lacking in the ever-growing body of scholarship on the war, for example, soldiers' reception of sacraments, their use of sacramentals, their prayer practices, and their conceptions of spiritual matters, we should spend some time considering how these wartime activities formed Catholic soldiers as Catholic men. When reading and analyzing Catholic newspapers, chaplains' diaries, soldiers' correspondence, and reminiscences of women religious who served as nurses in Civil War hospitals, what emerges is a glimpse of a world in which Catholic women played formative roles in mediating Catholic men's religious lives and in shaping a distinctly Catholic manhood. This is not altogether surprising, given the standard conclusion of scholars that so many devotional practices of 19th century American Catholic life were frequently understood, whether explicitly or implicitly, as feminine, and that it is common to follow Anne Braude's lead in starting with the assumption that women's history is American religious history. However, I think one of the dangers in not further interrogating these ideas is that we might easily conclude that men, many of whom devoted themselves in the Civil War era to the cultivation of what Amy Greenberg terms martial manhood, absented themselves from supposedly feminine practices. This was certainly not the case for Catholic soldiers, who turned frequently to praying the rosary, wearing miraculous medals, and donning scapulars, and who saw such items as not just spiritually nourishing, but physically protective as they enacted their martial manhood on the battlefield. As one Catholic writer noted of soldiers receiving both communion and scapulars at a mass in New Orleans during the first summer of the war, would to God every Catholic young man who engages in the conflict may so fortify himself by approaching the Holy Sacraments and wearing the livery of the Immaculate Mary, who never in the moment of danger abandons those who wear that holy badge. I'd like to encourage us to consider whether these often coded as feminine sacramentals and prayers were masculinized in the hands or around the necks of Catholic soldiers, or was something more complex occurring. How does or can a gendered spiritual practice or object maintain a neat gender identity when being passed back and forth between soldiers and women religious, who often served as the givers of these elements of Catholic spirituality to the same Catholic men at their most vulnerable in hospital wards or on their deathbeds? How should we evaluate a dying soldier's understanding of his salvation and his manhood when he was being quickly shepherded through baptism into both the church and the hereafter and prepared for communion, not by the presumed bearer of sacraments, the male priest, but by the Catholic figure seen usually by historians only as a nurse and hospital professional, the woman religious? At this time and during this war, experiencing a good death was of paramount importance to soldiers who craved the surety of both dying in a state of grace and guaranteeing their historical legacy as courageous men, as Drew Gilpin Faustus explained. It therefore seems significant to me that the promise of Catholic soldiers' salvation and the acknowledgement of their record of manly honor were so often being delivered, not by the men religious who dominated the hierarchy, but by the women religious who served in less publicly visible venues. And what of Catholic laywomen, who are perhaps even less historiographically visible as distinctly Catholic figures of the war than are women religious? They privately sent prayer books and religious medallions to their distant husbands serving on the battlefront, and they also served publicly as primary forgers of Catholic civil religion. Mid-19th century women, so often regarded in prescriptive literature of the time as ethereally pure paragons of virtue and restraint, sewed and presented battle flags for Catholic soldiers, who who would soon march into conflict to display a manhood that was anything but restrained. After one such flag presentation by Louisiana women to the Bienville Rifles in 1861, Father Cornelius Moynihan blessed the flag and told the assembled soldiers of the company that this banner, which the priest noted had been created by patriotic ladies, was the centerpiece of a ceremony representing an act of religion. The women's flag would, Father Moynihan noted, draw down on the soldiers' arms the blessing of the God of armies. This flag, he explained in terms reflecting the dominant gender ideology of the period, had been prepared by the area's fair daughters and embroidered by one woman's delicate hands, and should remind its bearer on the battlefield of his civil religious duties and to not shirk from courageous service, as he said, when the martial trumpet shall sound the signal for battle. It should also remind us of the malleability and uncertain contours of Catholic femininity and masculinity in times of both war and peace, and should give us pause when tempted to reflectively gender the spiritual objects and practices of the past. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. And just as a reminder, I know folks are trickling in here. Want to let you know that you can submit questions using the Q&A box towards the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we'll use that rather than the raise hand function. You can submit your question at any time. However, we're first going to go through, each panelist will first present, have a short time of discussion among themselves, then we'll turn it over to audience questions. Okay, and I'll make that a public announcement every so often. Okay, so next we have Dr. Catherine Dugan, who's an assistant professor of religion at Springfield College in Western Massachusetts, where I'm located too, and just started snowing, right, Catherine? Probably stuck indoors. She studies contemporary Catholicism in the US and is the author of Millennial Missionaries, How a Group of Young Catholics is Trying to Make Catholicism Cool by Oxford University Press. All right, the floor is yours.
Awesome, thanks so much, Lloyd. All right, so in 2010, Pope Benedict XVI called for the new evangelization, which was aimed at reinvigorating Catholicism in the traditionally Christian territories, namely Europe and North America. Imitating this effort to embody a sort of imagined past, in 2013, a layman founded what he calls the new evangelization because he's worried by what he calls a man crisis, and he's worried, as he says, that the faith of the church is feminine and men are underrepresented in the pews. This project is one of several that have emerged in the last decade around the formation of Catholic men and a particular interpretation of Catholic manhood. A sampling of others include the ones on this slide. Real Catholic's 30-Day Rise Challenge, which is aimed at training men who can rise up to the challenge of being fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands they were meant to be. Podcasts that normalize being a Catholic man, like Just Another Guy in the Pew, and projects like The Catholic Gentleman, where men can learn about, quote, manly saints, fear, dressing sharp, marriage, and spiritual weapons. These projects are a Catholic lens onto what has been called the male malaise. They are troubled that men do not know, have not learned, and are not being taught how to be men. The correctives that these programs offer are organized around Catholic gender complementarianism, around the role model of manly saints, and around cultivating strong communities of men. So I want to raise two sets of questions here. First, these projects are really puzzling to me because I'm not quite sure how to interpret these men's angst within contemporary US Catholicism. So I've been thinking about Sarah Imhoff's work on Jewish manhood, where she argues that these, quote, unmarked male bodies have under-articulated power. To ignore the particularities of men's lives and anxieties, she points out, gives male norms a sort of trans-historical presence. So this has got me wondering about an unmarked Catholic masculinity in my work, but also in Catholic studies. I'm more than two years into a project on Catholics who practice natural family planning, NFP. And I had originally conceived of this project as focused on Catholic women and women's reproductive choices. But almost from the beginning, women regularly asked me if their husbands could participate in the interviews. At trainings and conferences, I realized I was just as often listening to men's voices. Men were talking about fatherhood. I was hearing about pornography addictions. I've listened to men describe the loss they feel after miscarriages. And I've learned about devotions to Saints Joseph and Maximilian Kolbe, because these saints are held up as the models of a kind of Catholic masculinity for the 21st century. It turns out, I actually find it impossible to study women's NFP lives without also studying the lives of their husbands, fiancés, and boyfriends. The women's lives that I have thought were at the center of my questions are actually inseparable from the lives of the men with whom they are trying to build families. Realizing the presence of these unmarked men in my study of women and NFP has made me think anew about how to study gender complementarianism. Alyssa's work on men's devotional practices has really helped me think more carefully about homosocial male communities. So, what do I learn about US Catholicism when I consider how deeply intertwined the place of men's and women's marriages and reproductive choices are on this landscape? So, I have no answers. So the second set of questions that I have here is to think about projects like the new evangelization and NFP promoting men with a sense of gender analysis. Frankly, I don't know what to do with all the patriarchy sort of floating around in here. Michael Kimmel, the sociologist of manhood, once described the Promise Keepers as what he calls a gentler, kinder patriarchy, noting the real misogyny and homophobia of these groups. He also observed the immense sincerity of the guys, their earnestness, their friends, their confidence, their trying to listen closely to their wives and their children, he writes. Something similar is at work here among NFP Catholics and projects like the ones you see on the slide in front of you. These groups and their gender complementarianism are not benign. I know that there's patriarchy at work here. But also, I'm starting to wonder if patriarchy is too blunt of a term to describe what's actually happening here. Simply marking this as patriarchy seems to make it hard for me, at least, to see the actual men at work on Catholic manhood. And it makes it hard to understand the ways these men's lives are stitched into the life of contemporary US Catholicism. And I need to know what other kinds of gender analysis might be available and help us see in new ways. A final gesture to broader questions. So if I start with listening to men's experiences, which are distinct from, but not always separable from women's lives, what can I learn about what's really happening in 21st century Catholic manhood? And more broadly, how is our understanding of a US Catholic identity expanded and reshaped by attending carefully to these sincere efforts to cultivate Catholic manliness? Thanks, Yael.
And we all give our golf claps. All righty. Okay, so again, a reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and drop those into the Q&A. You do not have to wait until the end to submit your questions. Just feel free to do that as the presenters are giving their provocations. Okay, next we have Amy Kollinger, who's an associate professor in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion at Oregon State University, where she teaches courses in North American religious history, American Catholicism, and religious history of the American West. Dr. Amy Kollinger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's so good to see so many familiar names in the participants and attendees. It's good to see you all. So the first time, Harry the Human Windmill Greb and Jean the Fighting Marine Tunney met in a boxing ring in 1922. Tunney got the beating of a lifetime. Greb's first rally of punches unleashed a vicious left hook that smashed Tunney's nose into his skull, giving Tunney an instant double fracture that splattered both fighters with Tunney's blood. Harry Greb was known for his unorthodox style of mixing punches in such erratic combinations that his opponents couldn't predict the direction from which the next punch would come. Greb was also a notoriously dirty boxer, fond of elbowing and headbutting, raking the laces of his gloves across the eyes of his opponents. Stepping into the ring with Greb was an unnerving experience for a seasoned fighter. For a mid-career boxer like Tunney, it was nothing short of terrifying. After the 1922 fight, Tunney commented that boxing Greb was, quote, like fighting an octopus, unquote. Aficionados of the sport often count Tunney versus Greb as among the most brutal matches in boxing history. Through 15 rounds, Tunney and Greb pounded each other with furious determination. Greb focused on Tunney's face, punching his lips, gouging his eyes, and butting his forehead so hard that it severed a facial artery. In return, Tunney used the openings that were the weakness of Greb's erratic style to focus punishing blows and deep uppercuts on Greb's torso. In the middle of the 6th round, grappled in a clinch, the pair nearly fell out of the ring. The adrenaline Tunney's cut man gave him to staunch his nasal bleeding caused blood to flow down his throat and into his stomach, and it darkened his stool for days. Multiple lacerations on Tunney's face went clear through to the bone. Boxing historians estimate that Tunney lost 2 quarts of blood in the bout. Quote, Harry Greb cut Tunney so bad he swallowed more blood than Dracula, one colorful report observed. He looked as if he just lost a razor fight, not a fist fight. They almost needed a sewing machine to put his face back together, unquote. Reflecting on the terror that he experienced in the ring that day, Tunney wrote, quote, in every fighter comes occasionally the supreme horror of not being able to fend off the blows showered on him, of being helpless to raise his hands to warn them off. For a strategist like Tunney, boxing was as much an intellectual battle as it was a physical one. Throughout his career, he had struggled to overcome dread that would paralyze him immediately before a major bout. This was not a paranoid fantasy, as his brutal 15 rounds with Greb illustrates. In those moments of terror, Tunney often prayed that he would not be hurt for life in the ring, and he believed that those prayers protected his body and his mind in equal measure. Quote, when I prayed that I might not be permanently injured, I gained confidence that I wouldn't be, he wrote. If it hadn't been for this confidence I gained from prayer, I imagine that I'd have gone into the ring inwardly shaking and quaking, thoroughly beaten in advance. In my provocation, I want to highlight the unsurprising, I think, insight that I've gained from studying athletes, even as we recognize the cultural factors that shape Catholic manhood, we also, as a field, need to develop a much more robust, nuanced, promiscuous, scientifically and theoretically informed phenomenology of embodiment. We need to balance cultural semantics with bodily somatics. This seems obvious to say and simple to achieve, but case studies like my own demonstrate just how complex gendered and religious embodiment can be to understand. Whispering petitions to Our Lady, hoping to quiet his pounding heart as he sat on his dressing room table while his trainer wrapped his hands, Gene Tunney's world was a vortex of causal factors that shaped his experience of terror and the repertoire of responses available to him in that moment. Yes, Tunney was suspended in Geertzian webs of cultural significance that reflected his Catholic faith, but he also was inhabiting and managing an athletic body that had powerful impulses and imperatives all its own. The somatics of Tunney's manhood was influenced by economies of prayer and pain that shaped devotional practice in the first half of the 20th century, a uniquely Catholic worldview that understood physical suffering as a pathway to religious purity and bodily mortification as a tool for spiritual edification. But Tunney's body also had been trained in the sweet science of boxing, of hitting harder and faster and more accurately, while also possessing sufficient discipline to endure blow after blow without succumbing. Layering these on top of each other, a better analysis of Tunney's experience as a Catholic and as a Catholic man would appreciate how repetitive rituals of prayer change the neurological functioning of the brain, but also how years of physical training can shape body composition, hone reflexes, and imprint involuntary responses in muscles. It would recognize the curious conflict between boxing training that had taught Tunney to push pain out of his active consciousness and Catholic practice that had urged him to embrace suffering as a form of spiritual embodiment. It would bear in mind that Tunney's hand knew equally the rhythmic pulse of a trainer wrapping his hands before a match, the sensation of smooth rosary beads between his fingers, the percussion of landing a blistering uppercut on an opponent's gut, and the discipline to not fall into shock while losing blood both internally and externally. And this is my provocation for Catholic studies, to find a vocabulary that's inclusive enough to acknowledge both the semiotic and the somatic components of gendered experience and perception, to understand better how adrenaline and blood, terror and prayer, and habituation to rosaries and hand wrapping all intersect in the lives of Catholic men.
I can hear the hand claps from the East Coast to the West Coast. All right. And quite the pugilistic provocation. Thank you for that. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on. Our next presenter, Dr. Alisa Maldonado Estrada, is an assistant professor of religion at Kalamazoo College and is the author of Lifeblood of the Parish, Men and Catholic Devotion in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, published by NYU Press just last year. She is co-chair of the Men and Masculinities unit of the American Academy of Religion and is an editor of the journal Material Religion, the Journal of Art, Objects, and Belief. Right. You're up.
Thanks so much, Lloyd. And hi, everyone. Thank you for spending your evening with us today. So I have a few big starting questions. What if we did Catholic studies a little more irreverently? What if we made Catholic studies more ethnographic? How would these two moves help us better understand Catholic traditions and communities as sites where masculinities are made? For me, doing Catholic studies irreverently means decentering the hierarchy, theologies, sacraments, and moral and social teachings, and spending time with people and even practicing alongside them to see what they imagine makes them Catholic, to see what keeps them part of a parish community, and to see what they imagine to be devotion. For 6 years, I studied Italian American Catholic men in Brooklyn. In my book, Lifeblood of the Parish, I particularly focused on men's participation in the church's Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel and San Paolino di Nola, an annual celebration that is well over a century old in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. We all know it's important to study practice, but what I especially learned in my fieldwork is that we cannot assume what practices matter to our subjects, nor can we have preconceived notions of what Catholic practices even are. Instead, we should explore how practices come to matter. For me, this meant I had to think about parish space differently. The men in this community, especially during and in preparation for devotional celebrations, spent much of their time in the parish's lower hall and basement. They made devotional objects with their own hands and mundane materials from Dollar Tree and Home Depot. Some worked in the rectory on spreadsheets and fundraising rather than walking on processions during saints' feasts. What binds these men to the church and to each other is a shared ethic of labor for the parish. The idea that they can give their time, bodies, and skills to help maintain devotional traditions and raise money for their parish masculinizes their practices. It helps them see themselves as essential to the church's survival and authoritative in its history. Ethnographic methods meant I spent time with these men in the spaces that mattered most to them. In the parish basement, I helped them paint saints and build the Giglio, the 70-foot tall tower they lift in honor of St. Paulinus. In the basement, which you see some shots of here, they were not precious about devotional objects. They were pragmatic and often irreverent. Decorum didn't matter when they had to patch up the broken bodies of saints, sawing off their heads and ripping the garments off of statues and leaving them naked in order to repair them. They joked about presence while at the same time imbuing things with personhood through language and squeamishness while dealing with their statue bodies. They see this manual and artistic labor as religious work. As one man said about his work in the basement, after working down here, if I go to hell, something is wrong. This has to count for something in the afterlife. They find value and community in this kind of labor. They also find recognition in it, with the parish offering awards and promotions for men who do the most for the church. Ethnography, and specifically embodied ethnography, where I worked alongside the men, allowed me to see how masculinity in this community was made in homosocial spaces where men could mobilize bodily and professional skills to help the church. Crossing those gender boundaries and taking up devotional labor myself was perhaps irreverent to their gender norms and also to traditional ethnographic conventions, but was essential to my ethnographic method. Being a woman in that space allowed me to understand the embodied knowledge essential to becoming a competent man in this community and how that knowledge is cultivated. In this community, I also found that devotion is good business. The feast raises hundreds of thousands of dollars each year for the parish. People come for novenas and masses and processions, but there's an entire backstage world where money is what matters. As scholars of Catholicism, we know that money matters. We know that property and buildings and their upkeep matter. All of these are institutional realities. But here, I'm not talking about parish or diocesan budgets. I'm talking about the physical, dirty work of counting dollars as religious practice. Donations for scapulars and candles and mass offerings and money pinned to statues all need to be accounted for. And at this church, there's a crew of parishioners dedicated to doing just that, counting money. In the money room, which is tucked in the rectory or the parish gym, a crew worked on counting thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of dollars each night of the feast. The money room has its own internal logic and skills that need to be honed for the operation to run smoothly. The man who runs it, which we saw him in the last slide, he has an MBA and he works for Catholic Charities. And for him, counting, collecting, and soliciting money is religious work. As he once said, "For God's sake, I don't think it will get me into heaven, but it maybe will shave some time off purgatory." So in my research, I center objects under construction and I center financial work because this is the stuff that mattered to men in the community. These are the practices that they charge with meaning, the distinctly Catholic meaning of maintaining a neighborhood parish, honoring the saints, and creating an exclusive community of men. They see themselves as helping keep the doors open in a parish that has often struggled financially, that has seen its church buildings knocked down for urban renewal projects, and is now in a super gentrified neighborhood. These practices are constructed as masculine, giving men a sense of ownership, authority, purpose, and respect in this community. Studying masculinities and Catholic devotion meant not having a set idea about what service, prayer, or procession looked like. Making room for the irreverent, mundane, and practical shows us how men are made in church and its many backstage spaces, and demonstrates how devotionalism is and continues to be an arena for the making of masculinity. Thank you.
All right, round of applause. I guess it'll be not too long till they start having to count Bitcoin down in the basement, huh?
They have the little like credit card dip machines now and stuff, so I'm sure.
Already there, great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Just a quick reminder, folks, again in the audience, if you have questions, go ahead and submit those through the Q&A function. Do not use the chat function, use the Q&A function. It's much easier to manage the questions as they come that way. Okay, next we have Jean Petit, professor and chair of the history department at Hope College. She is currently working on a book project about the interfaith origins of the USO, the United Services Organization. All righty, floor is yours.
Thanks. Hi. I am really pleased to be part of this panel. I've just found it fascinating. So thank you for this. So tonight, my kind of linking in the research of Catholics and trying to make a case for national belonging in the World War I era. And what I'm finding interesting is this idea of sort of trying to play around with modern masculinity and how the Knights of Columbus during World War I were doing that, and very much in opposition, particularly to the YMCA. And so I want to consider some of the questions that have come up in this research for me. So when the war began, the government needed help, and we see this sort of church-state cooperative effort that happens. And they wanted help to create recreation opportunities for soldiers in training camps. Now, they went to common sense. They went to a group that they thought knew a lot about this, the YMCA, with the triangle, the three-parted idea of mind, body, spirit, that they could train men in this. And so they were the first organization brought into this effort by the War Department. And the Knights of Columbus pushed back right away. And they, they insisted Catholics need to be involved, that Catholics should be central to this work, because so many troops are going to be Catholic. They worried about proselytization by the YMCA. But what's interesting too is how they're carving out a place for themselves, and they create a kind of idea that they are more in touch with the common man, more in some ways more modern in their approach than the YMCA. So, for instance, when Supreme Knight James Flaherty first met with Raymond Fosdick, the head of the War Department of this effort, he reported back how Fosdick was having difficulties with the Sabbatarian Baptists in the matter of Sunday baseball, that the YMCA, for religious reasons, was refusing to allow sports on Sundays. And the Knights came in and said, we're much more practical than that. We are going to do that. And so we see them kind of creating a niche for themselves and a kind of a more, again, more pragmatic kind of masculinity. And we see this as the war, as it continues in Europe. You see their famous slogan during World War I, everybody welcome, everyone free. And the YMCA in Europe was getting a reputation for being like too officious, to having movies and other entertainments, but then forcing prayer on people afterwards. And the Knights was instead framing themselves as, we welcome anyone of any faith. We will not like force you to pray at our events. And so we see this this kind of approach. Now, it was somewhat tricky. You know, the YMCA sent thousands of workers over to Europe, while the Knights only sent hundreds. And Raymond Fosdick of the War Department accused them of, quote, playing a rather selfish game, in that they could give away free chocolates and cigarettes while the YMCA was left to run the canteens where they had to charge. And so the Knights definitely, you know, called them mercenary and that sort of thing. And you also see Fosdick criticizing them for like doing their work with, quote, the limelight strikes. They did boxing matches, the fun stuff, while the YMCA was left to do a lot of the stunt work. So they very much tried to use the publicity to kind of show themselves in a more positive light, again, more in touch with the average soldier. Now, as the war was continuing, the Knights of Columbus, they all needed money. And so in 1918, actually right towards the end of the war, the organizations involved with the War Department did the United War Work campaign to make funds. I just find these posters really interesting. And I included the YMCA as well as the Jewish Welfare Board, which was another group that was part of the United War Work campaign. And the YMCA poster is, you know, you have warm colors. You see the kind of nurturing work the YMCA was doing. What I find interesting about the Knights and the Jewish Welfare Board, both the sort of more minority religions, is you see them a more kind of acknowledging of the war, right? That the soldiers are going in, and that that their men are their men of their faith are in the fight, and this is part of their national belonging. Just quickly at the end here, one place though where the Knights probably did not kind of meet the modern moment was inclusion of women in war work. The YMCA brought, you know, a few thousand women over to Europe to do the work, and the Knights refused, and that held them back. And John Burke of the National Catholic War Council criticized this, saying that, you know, that there is not one Catholic woman in war service, and that this is, he said, because of our lack of preparation, the Catholic body has lost one of the great opportunities presented to it. The Knights saw their work as by men for men, and women didn't have a place in it, but that in the end hurt the Catholic war effort. But it also showed a fissure within the Catholic community about how to meet the modern moment in terms of gender. And the NCWC, the War Council, National Catholic War Council, was going to be much more forward, and they created a place for women to serve in these visitor houses at war camps. And I think I'm out of time there. So just thinking about national belonging and how masculinity and ideas of gender can be part of that for Catholics. And I will stop sharing. Oh, there we go.
All right. And a resounding round of applause, finger snaps, all that good stuff. Yes, wartime posters, some of my favorite historical artifacts. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so we have our final presenter. And again, just a reminder, after our last presenter, we will, the panelists will just go back and forth for about 10 minutes or so of discussion. Then we'll take questions from the audience. And I do see those trickling in, but continue to ask away. Okay, so finally we have Dr. John Seitz. He's an associate professor in the Department of Theology and associate director of the Curran Center for American Catholic Studies at Fordham University. He teaches and writes in the areas of religious studies and US religious history. He is at work on a book about priesthood. All right, floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for being here. Masculinity, which is already, of course, a messy arena of desire, gets even messier when claims of holiness and divine mediation get mixed in. All the pressure around saying or performing what a man is gets scrambled and supercharged when saying or performing what a priest man is. Because of priests' maleness, and because of their elevated status in the church, holiness and masculinity had a lot to do with how Roman Catholics lived their lives, what options were open to them, which dimensions of control and meaning they had available to them, which they did not. My provocation has to do with how holiness and masculinity worked in one instance of clerical sex abuse in the middle to the late 20th century among Midwestern Euro-Americans in the US. I just want to say, of course, there are many ways that priestly masculinity shapes sex abuse and cover-up, in this and in other settings. I want to note in particular, US priests bonded masculinity of fraternalism. This form of masculinity included a kind of heroism associated with shared acceptance of sacrifice of family, sex, of certain comforts. And when one hero slipped up, other heroes were there to assure him that it didn't violate or void his heroism, but only provided an opportunity to restore it. When we see time and again bishops celebrating known abuser priests for their good work, noting how their true spiritual gifts could still be fruitful, we are in the realm of this kind of toxic, holy, fraternal masculinity. It becomes evident as well when we read the dismissive and patronizing letters bishops and others addressed to parents, often women, who had the courage to come forward with a concern about a priest. Fraternalism forged in the shared sacrifices of one's brothers was a crucial dimension of leaders' willingness to overlook abuse, keep secrets, and trust promises of reform. But the case I want to talk about today is not precisely about this form of heroic self-sacrificing fraternal masculinity, but about the kind of masculinity that plays off and against those narratives, while also keeping them in reserve for a rainy day. This is a form of US masculinity that we might label a late 1960s style emo masculinity, pivoting self-consciously from the emotional reticence of the World War II generation. Certain men of this era made feeling, sensitivity, authenticity, and expressiveness their signal virtues. These are men who share, men whose unimposing, even vulnerable style of masculinity is a play on and against the supposed stoicism and rigidity of previous generations. This feeling man worked his charms precisely because of the presence behind it of the stoic man. It was remarkable, attractive, fun, and compelling precisely for the ways that it defied expectations. Maybe Ben Braddock from the 1967 film, The Graduate, is a good example. I hope Tony Smith can correct me if I'm wrong about that. Like their non-clerical counterparts, some priests of the 1960s gravitated to this kind of masculinity. It took shape in seminarians' efforts to upend the rigidities of their formation as priests. It helped them become advocates of things like the folk mass and less hierarchical parish leadership structures and greater connection with the people. Priests are just men, they said, with renewed vehemence and to a more receptive audience. This meant they were people, not remote, distant functionaries. This was the kind of priestly masculinity that Jesuit John Powell mobilized in his abuse of victims in the latter half of the 20th century. Powell groomed the youngest of his victims in the late 1960s, 13-year-old Florence Braun, the diet of irreverent anti-authoritarian poses, including sneaking her into an avant-garde French film, scoffing at her parents' conservatism, talking with her about his needs as a man, and joking about how during his abuse, everyone else thought they were performing confession. You can also see how his publications, with which he became very famous, likewise drew on a vogue for authenticity. Crucially though, Powell's reworked fun, feeling, sharing, clerical masculinity did not abdicate the spiritual potency of the priest as a unique mediator of God's presence in the lives of the unordained. At one point, a confused Florence asked about the priest's behavior with her, how it related to his vow of celibacy. In answer, Powell drew on the mighty clerical otherworldliness, recounting a time when the crucified Jesus appeared to him, looked down off the cross, and told him that what he was doing with her, to her, was right and good. Since then, abuse survivor Florence has sometimes had the terrifying vision of a looming crucified Christ floating in the sky above her. So just as they protested their dehumanization in the rigidities of previous models of clerical masculinity, it was also the case that priests were never just men. They were still priests, unique mediating holiness of whom had not been denied or meaningfully diminished, even as new ecclesiologies lifted up a priesthood of all believers. And so the 1960s era emo masculinity of sharing and authenticity became supercharged and scrambled when joined with the church's steady ideas about clerical holiness. It was a powerful combination. It was liberating in its rejection of excessive guilt, stifled feelings, stunted development, and yet it was energized and intensified with the abiding possibility that the new cool priesthood was still a special site for commerce with God. That gave the priest man who shared and with whom you could share, continuing and even perhaps more dangerous power than that held by the remote, stoic, authoritarian priest man. Thinking about shifting forms of masculinity may thus offer an important window onto the social and interpersonal dynamics of sex abuse in the Catholic tradition. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much for that. Okay, so we're gonna take a few minutes. The panelists will respond to the provocations put forth by one another. And then shortly after that, we'll transition over into a time of Q&A from the audience. And I see we have several questions in the queue already, so thank you for those, keep them coming. So, panelists, yes, any reflections?
Skipping ahead here, I'm sorry, go ahead. Skipping ahead here, I'm just looking through the questions really fast. And there's one that really stood out to me. I'm sure maybe we can come back again. So I'm sorry, Catherine Osborne, I'm kind of stealing your question here. But she talked about the absence of queerness. And this is something that I was thinking of all these papers, mine included. And we really are very much stuck in a gender binary of masculine and feminine. And I'm, curious to see, is there a way of breaking out of that in our studies of masculinity? Do we kind of lock ourselves into that just by, focusing on masculine and then kind of necessarily assuming that feminine is the only alternative?
So my question might answer that a little bit. Is some of the literature I've seen geared towards Catholic boys in the first half of the 20th century is very concerned about overly feminized boys and the church's efforts to look more butch. And I was thinking about that actually in terms of Kate's presentation. So this thought that Catholic men are still worried about who's teaching Catholic men to be manly. This seems to be a perennial thing, not just something that happens in a particular time period. And that might be worth thinking about. If I'm seeing it in the early 20th century and you're seeing it in the early 21st century, we might get someone from the 19th century to also talk about whether that was a concern then too. But there is, in the early 20th century, it's not framed in terms of queerness, but it's framed in terms of this fear of kind of, they keep using the words like limp to talk about kind of Catholic men and their relationships with their mommies.
Yeah, Catherine's point struck me too. Oh, go ahead, Kate. Kate, go. Oh no, I was thinking with the Knights and their insistence on just men working for men, during the war, when other groups were now starting to reach out, and women were really important war workers, because a lot of them, if you noticed in my posters, the men picture were older men, because younger men had to be part of the draft. It's a good question for Catherine. I'll just say it's a good question for me to think about as I move forward in this, is how, because you see them very defensive about this, and some of it is, the women are going to seduce the men in the canteen or wherever they're hiring them, and that the danger of that. But thinking about other things going on there is an interesting point. So
Thanks, Jean, and thank you all for this. I was thinking about the trouble that we all seem to be having with what adjective to put before masculinity. Like when we were writing the proposal list, I remember you were like, oh yeah, we have to put masculinities, right? So we know that there's a plurality here, but John's got emo masculinity. I glossed mine Catholic, but I know it's not all Catholic. Like it's a particular. So I'm struck by this, like what adjectives to put before masculinity, and I think maybe Brian Kleist mentioned it too. Like what are we describing, and what are we talking about when we're using those two, the adjective and the noun masculinity or masculinities? So I'm wondering if any of you, how you chose what adjective to put before masculinity in your thinking today. I'd love to hear how you all, or any of you, made that decision.
Just to jump in really quickly, I think I was kind of thinking Biederman and the kind of shift she talks about from the late 19th into the 20th century with the manliness and masculinity, and it's happening in a maybe more subtle way in this war work, but I see that kind of the older chivalrous kind of Knights of Columbus, which Amy has written about in the late 19th century. You still see some of that in their war work, but they are really trying to kind of move into a more a different approach. And some of it's kind of like more, again, that pragmatic thing of, doing and boxing and sports and that. But also, but they're kind of pulled in different directions there. And so when I say modern, I'm thinking of sort of the shifts, particularly, the World War I and post-war era of the kind of the gender debates going on at that time.
I'll jump in here. Kate, I found, your discussion about using the word patriarchy and maybe it being too blunt, or when we put that out there, it does a certain work. Like it has all of these associations. So I found, your troubling of that to be just an important methodological contribution. So if we think about men's experience and we're trying to understand their experience, what does it mean to then call it a patriarchal masculinity? Or I know in terms of the men that I've studied, to call it like a cis, hetero, white ethnic Catholicism. Like there are ways I could have done that. And then there are lots of times where I chose not to give all of their descriptors. And so, yeah, I wonder, you're asking us what the move is to like, what adjective do we put? And I wonder how taking away adjectives might also do a certain work there. And about Catherine's question on queerness, I just think it's so interesting in all of these spaces, deliberate methods of exclusion so that queerness, if it exists, is erased. And especially, the men that I study, they hang out together, they do rituals where they're touching each other and sweating and holding hands and up against each other. And so there is a certain homoeroticism that needs to go along with explicit exclusion of men who are not straight in order to make that space possible and to keep it intact. So yeah, exclusion of queerness, I think, is a thing that's very present in lots of these spaces that we're studying.
What's so interesting about that is the possibility, of course, that is something that laymen experience that Catholic priests do not. I mean, my time with Catholic priests suggests that there's more fluidity about these things and less queer panic. And I wonder, John, if you're finding that too.
Well, I mean, certainly there's an awareness of history, of a history of critique and concern around masculinity as it applies or does not apply to priests. Priests, I think, are highly aware that they're perceived in a different way than men who are not priests. But then, and so, in a way, they have to kind of adapt to that kind of expectation, and it may, in some cases, I think, yes, open up possibility that they don't have those same urgencies, perhaps, to name and define themselves in a certain masculine way. I mean, but it always comes along with the other side, right? I mean, I think, you know, Daniel Lord, who has this famous story of a priest or two laymen talking about a priest on a train, and they're self-consciously eating a salad, right? And they say, well, you know, 10 years ago, this would have been made us candidates for the Ladies' Aid Society, right? So Daniel Lord, this famous priest, writing about masculine priesthood, but then also acknowledging the sort of fluidity of the boundaries of masculinity as these Catholic men are breaking them and seeing the flow or the difference and the change over time. I just want to add something to this conversation, which is also just an awareness of the homoerotic dimensions of the priesthood and the homoerotic dimensions of life in seminaries and life in the priesthood itself and the Catholic worship itself. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of, around sex abuse, there's a lot of scholarship that shows a kind of tolerance among the priesthood for sex with men, even sex with young men, even sex with boys, that wouldn't be the same if it was sex with women. The tolerance would not be applied in the same way because of, you know, the fear of scandal that is, in their view, more likely with sex with women. So that's another dimension of and does for sure, Catherine, elevate this question of queerness into the conversation.
Should we try to turn? We've got some. Can everybody who's attending also see the questions, or is that just us? There are some excellent questions in the Q&A. So I don't know how to. Lloyd, in your expertise, you have any way to pick one. But so I'll just say thank you all for some thought-provoking questions here in the Q&A.
Sure. Might I suggest that we turn to some of the questions that respond directly to the provocation set forth by the panelists. So we have an excellent question that riffs off of Dr. Collinger's question. So one of the attendees would like to hear others' thoughts on Dr. Collinger's methodological suggestion to incorporate scientific studies and pay more attention to the somatic body. If you were to take up this call, how might that change your studies, specifically in terms of gender and masculinity?
I don't know thanks for that question, Charles. I'll just say that I want the last line of what you said, Amy. I just sort of like want it to be posted somewhere. Because what you were raising is really the tensions of how it seems like the men you're thinking about are trying to, and John is saying this, maybe we're all saying this, how to do all these things at the same time under the category of masculinity while it's a shifting, like even the landscape under what the men that I'm thinking about is shifting all of the time. And they're trying to parse these tensions about how to be a man without, and at least the new evangelization guys there's like a sense of no guideposts, right? So there's like sort of a bouncing around to different things to try to pick up a guidepost. So that's not exactly the answer to the question, but it gets at the sort of the ways that even the guidance forward for the men that I'm thinking about. Yeah, sure, take up some body practice, right? Like, sure, bounce around and see what the Bible has to say. There's a big question mark there.
I'll add in here too. That's okay. Amy, I really liked, I don't know, I liked your use of the word promiscuous in thinking about how we're going to do this, or thinking about like phenomenology and all of that. So I appreciate this call to take up the body. And I especially like the way you were thinking of all of the many places where, I don't know, where men or masculine subjects undergo a certain sort of somatic training and bodily disciplining, and especially like opening it up to think outside of explicitly Catholic sites where Catholics are made, like sacramental pedagogy and all of that. So to just pay attention more to musculature and how certain things feel. And for at least the guys that I study, where, you know, they lift this big, heavy object. Being Catholic for them is like knowing how to do that, or having certain muscle formation in the shoulders, or knowing how to, I don't know, navigate through all of these spaces that are not the explicitly Catholic spaces we typically think about. So this is all just to say, I love the call to pay attention more to the body and its training, and I don't know how that integrates with normal Catholic pedagogy and how that happens in other sites.
Yeah, I mean, we pay a lot of attention to sacramental bodies, but, you know, the body is this point of articulation for all of the cultural cross currents, and they become embedded in very different ways. And so thinking about bodies only in sacramental practice actually ignores, I think, the majority of Catholic experiences of their bodies and how those are so complicated in other ways.
Okay, unless someone wants to respond directly to that question, we have another question from the audience that directly speaks to one of the provocations. This one's set forth by Alyssa. So there's a question that states, thinking of Alyssa's call to make space for irreverence and Amy Collinger's attention to theorize a culturally shaped affect endurance and survivance of suffering. I am wondering how we might take the idea of martyrdom and imagine it as both wasteful and fruitful, uncontainable and still managed, and targeted for purpose of salvation in the ultimate sense. Reminded again of Alyssa's interlocutors who weren't sure, but still hopeful that all of their labor would lead to heaven.
Something I come across a lot in my research. I mean, it's like, you know, this is like mentioning about the good death. I mean, there's this, you know, deep fear that these soldiers who are dying away from their families and not surrounded by loved ones, that they're going to be damned, despite the fact that they're sacrificing everything, you know, for their country and for their church. And for a lot of the Catholic soldiers that I'm looking at, whether Confederate or Union, for them, you know, there was no separating the secular and the spiritual. This was a, you know, they were convinced it was or at least they wanted to be convinced it was both a religious sacrifice, it was a martyrdom for, you know, for the church and for their country. So I mean, like, you know, I think this is something that they were deeply concerned with, that, you know, that their deaths were going to be a waste. And, you know, there's so much anxiety they express, you know, in their letters, and at least in the letters from, you know, from chaplains. So it's sometimes tough to figure out exactly what somebody on their deathbed is feeling, but at least, you know, they evince this, like, you know, terrible anxiety that it's all for naught. And that even if they've, like, you know, been baptized and they've received the last rites, that none of it really mattered. And, you know, and something I see quite a bit, and it's something I'm trying to be attentive to in, you know, my research as well. And at least, you know, the priests seem to be, you know, at pains, you know, in their diaries to you know, want to believe that receiving unction and receiving anointing actually mattered, and that it wasn't, you know, basically a wasteful martyrdom.
Would others like to respond to that?
I want to add on to this question that Brandon, I love this question. I don't know what to do about the martyrdom and the glorification of suffering that I mean, Maximilian Kolbe, I mean, these saints that these guys love, they're the most brutal saints' lives that you can find. And these are the go-tos. help me think through how you all think about martyrdom and suffering in the crafting of masculinities here, if anybody has thoughts on that.
What is it that bothers you about that?
Right? What is it? It's so gory, and so like it's such a glorification of manhood through suffering. It's like a straight line, and maybe it's my own like bias. Like I just want there's other ways of being a Catholic man, and you guys don't see it. Like I might still be at that. But yeah, it's the emphasis on martyrdom. It makes me feel nervous about the kinds of men that are being crafted. It's not. I guess it's not bad. It is.
But yeah, how would that? What kind of man is crafted by? I mean, that the question is, what kind of man is crafted by that, right?
Right. Yeah. Yes. So I'll open up to others. But what's happening on my end is that these men take on suffering in their marriages, right? And so they model themselves after the suffering of Catholic saints by modeling a suffering in their marriages or for their kids. And so there's like a like this sort of upside down patriarchy is the word that ends up sort of glorifying my suffering for the good of others. And I'm not quite sure what to do with it is all.
Guess I could jump in here. So it's very interesting. Among the men that I studied, I found the theme of suffering to be quite muted. They were whenever they talked about sacrifice, it was always quantified. It was always in terms of like the hours that they gave in labor to the parish, or the number of years they dedicated to this particular tradition. And so they weren't, these two quotes that I gave y'all about purgatory and heaven, I think these are the only time they ever talked about salvation. They never talked about salvation. They never talked about heaven. They never talked about Jesus. They almost never talked about the Bible. So it was these two times. But I think they see themselves located in this broader economy of, at least within the parish, like work and upward mobility in order to get a certain type of authority and respect. So rather than thinking about suffering, I think they're thinking about legacy and how they're going to go down in parish history or be remembered by those later, the same way they remember, like, you know, their ancestors in the parish that came before them. So yeah, I think legacy and martyrdom, they're connected in a lot of ways. But I don't know if suffering is always has to be linked to Catholic masculinities.
Right. Well, allow me to put another question out there. So we have another question which asks, well, first, thank you to all. Mostly listening and learning so much. Masculinity, quote, a messy field of desire, as John said. The person is wondering, I wonder if you could say a little more about the balancing of, quote, men are people too, per what Kate said, and patriarchal critique, including responsibility of individual men.
So I think this is Julie Byrne. I wonder if she's asking about what degree we try to be really sensitive to the individuals that we're thinking about and writing about and getting to know in our research, alongside of an imperative to voice, concern or criticism of male dominance in the church or male power or abuse, in my case, for example. This is a really tricky thing, Julie, as you always raise difficult questions. I think, it's particularly difficult with abusers because, these are folks whose behavior is like really hard to even picture and hard to even imagine. And the idea of getting to know them and thinking about their individuality and their development and their needs as individuals poses a lot of challenges. There are obviously cases where, there are some cases where you get to watch a priest abuser recognize his abuse and the pain he caused. It's not that common, but it does happen, and that poses even more distinct challenges. So I would just, I guess I'd say, make a plea and a affirmation of the idea that we should be able to try to do both of those things at the same time. I don't know, that's not really like a sufficient answer, but I appreciate you raising the question.
So we have a couple of questions as well that have touched on the topic about race and ethnicity. So to ask, just to pick up one of those questions, there's one that's specifically for Professor Dugan, but others should feel free to comment as this pertains to your research in some way or another. So this question asks, do the new evangelization digital artifacts have anything that seem to indicate racial diversity of American Catholic men, or does it seem exclusive to white men? Any mention needs or concerns of Latino men, for example? And this was asked, so the person that identified themselves, Catherine Schmidt from Malloy College.
Right, this is a great and important question. This is it's a white effort. This is a version of white Catholicism. I don't think that they're like opposed to Latinx or to Latino men or Black men or others being involved, but there's no, I haven't seen yet active efforts to reach out across racial boundaries. So that's there's not, I'm not seeing intentional efforts to change it, and it has been what I have found primarily a white group. Although among the NSP men, there are increasingly, I'm finding more Latino men in my conversations, but again, not a ton.
So when I see folks unmute, I'm thinking that you might want to answer, but I'm not quite sure. I don't want to short circuit any potential answer. And folks should feel free also to pick up any questions from the Q&A.
I mean, I can just, say a little bit that athletics is one of those areas, particularly boxing, where those racial barriers become a little bit more muddy, ethnic ones too. So Catholic men who may have lived very lives that were constrained by racial or ethnic categories, there's more give in that in athletic spaces, even in Catholic athletic spaces. So there's the resonances of those identities are not quite the same. And so we can think about these, I like Alyssa's sense of these homosocial spaces, that maybe in these homosocial spaces, particularly ones that are engaged with the body so much, competition outweighs the impulse to protect a certain kind of racialized masculinity. It's a nice contrast.
Yeah, certainly. So we do have another question. And I saw the question in its earlier form. I don't know what happened to the question, but we had a question about the way masculinity is constructed in relation to the gaze of non-Catholics, how now Catholics perceive the ability of masculinity. I'm trying to remember the question well, but yeah, some folks were wondering about that.
It was Rachel Gross's question, and I know John and I were typing answers to it in the Q&A, but I'll just say it for everyone here. So the guys that I've studied imagine themselves and are New Yorkers, old Brooklyn, all of that. And so I think that they construct their own ethnic identities and Catholic identities vis-a-vis gentrifiers and hipsters. So these seemingly inauthentic white others that are in their midst. And so, yeah, they imagine themselves as hardy and authentic, and keeping up tradition in ways that people moving from out of state are constantly threatening. And so they enact in very antagonistic ways sometimes during processions, flipping off gentrifiers, cursing them out, making fun of their practices, sometimes during literal religious processions. So this is something they imagine and narrate, but also something they very much do during their public Catholic rituals.
I just responded to that in the question and answer box too. That's why I've been typing responses to several of these. But I'll take this one because anti-Catholicism is like anti-Catholicism and the Catholic response are my main subject of research for a while now. And I think that like there's some truth to it's in the edited volume Catholics in the American Century. Wilfred McClay calls it the dyad of American religious history is the Catholic Protestant interaction. And so thinking of in the antebellum period with convent narratives, one of the chief accusations is that Catholic priests were actually these hypersexual predators who were threatening young virtuous Protestant women who would be enticed into joining the church if they were attending convent schools, and then they would be sexually abused and disgraced by these lecherous priests. So for Catholics who are really attuned to anti-Catholic attacks and apologetics, this is a major preoccupation of theirs. Is portraying Catholic men as actually being virtuous, and preserving pure white womanhood, and really working feverishly to combat the image of the Catholic Church as not only politically subversive but sexually subversive as well. And trying to, I think, very effectively and actively rebut the idea of Catholic priests as being kind of simultaneously unmanned and hyper men or something. And so I think that dealing with anti-Catholicism was always kind of a preoccupation for Catholic men defining themselves as men.
Yeah, just briefly add, during the World War I period, where they're really kind of forced to work together, particularly in the United War Work campaign, but before that at military camps, the YMCA, Knights of Columbus. YMCA, it's really, when you read the sources, it's very interesting. You feel a kind of sense that they see this war work as an opportunity to kind of shore up Protestant authority in the country. And they're aware of the Catholics and Jews, and they're kind of paternalistic to the Jewish workers, and the Catholics they just kind of see as rude and annoying. Well, the Catholics and Jewish people involved in this effort were really defensive about the Protestants and just eating it up with a spoon when the criticisms of the YMCA were coming in. They saw this as sort of affirming themselves and their work in this. And then in terms of that kind of idea of masculinity, there was a lot of organizations, not just the Knights, were really accusing the YMCA workers of being cowardly, of running from the fight, of the kind of long-haired men kind of giving their esoteric sermons instead of talking bluntly and truly to the men. So you see a lot of that kind of criticism the YMCA is kind of reflecting back on the way they're doing it right, as working with the men and being a good example of masculinity. So it's just interesting.
So I think the heaviness of the present moment, the past couple of weeks, might be factoring into this question. So we have a question. Again, this is directed for Professor Kate Dugan, but again, anyone can answer if there's any sort of relatable comparisons here. So someone is wondering if you've run into Dumais' Jesus and John Wayne, and I wonder what she sees in her emergent data with masculinities and NFP as different from or similar to development over the last 50 years of a militaristic nationalistic evangelicalism and a heavily monetized, sorry, this question is broken into a couple parts here, also specifically a part of culture war narratives. Might there be any relation to that to some of the folks you all study?
I'll just say a word on this, but it links back to a question that Brian Kleitz asked us too, is this about changes in Catholicism or is this about changes in culture, and where is the overlap? I'm struck by the emphasis that we are talking so much about laymen, and only one of us is thinking about priests. I don't think that the NFP men stand outside of the culture wars. They're very much in part of it. I don't know what to do about the nationalism that's sort of on the sidelines of what I've studied about these men so far, but I'm hearing you all think about the way that New York identity is tied in and ethnic identities is tied in. So I would love to hear what others are thinking about nationalism and how the culture shifts versus the Catholic shifts are playing out in the masculinities that emerge in each. I mean, really, we've covered so many time periods here. So in each moment, we're seeing different layers at play. So I'll just layer that onto the question more than anything.
So Kate, you did signal something about the focus kind of on lay versus clerical roles, and there is a question directed to John. Where did it go? Wondering if let's see, you saw differences. Sorry, folks, sometimes these questions kind of come and go. Maybe you already answered it. Maybe that's why not there, but differences in the construction of masculinity between lay folks and the clergy around these cases of abuse.
I think that, yeah, I saw a question about whether or not, ways Catholics were talking about authenticity, how that overlapped with other religious communities, other developments in the culture in the 70s and 80s or late 60s into the 80s. And I would just say, yeah, I mean, I think the Catholics of this generation, the Catholic priests of this generation were very, very interested in being in tune with the culture. I mean, they took pride in being in tune with the culture and wanted to be up to date like that. And that was a helpful way for them to see themselves as connected with the people, as ready to help them and ready to be not, their stodgy forebears, but guys who could be in the streets with people and connect with them on what they're already interested in, right? So, my reference to The Graduate it's kind of a nod to that kind of curiosity on the part of priests in that era. And so I don't think they're at all separated from cultural developments, and of course they flow that into, I kind of think about cramming, those norms of masculinity into the holiness bags, holiness boxes that the church has, right? And those boxes move and shift, or those suitcases tear apart at the seams, but they keep trying to put the masculinity into the holiness box and the holiness into the masculinity box. And so I think that's the way I imagine it.
Would others like to reflect on any of these questions? And if looks like we're running pretty short on time here, so I'll go ahead and wrap it up then and say thank you to everyone for joining us for this roundtable on studying Catholic masculinities, Catholic style. Hope you all have a good night. And I think we have a word from Tony or Kate. Do you have something to share?
I don't have anything, but I thought we should all give a shout out to you, Lloyd. I think you have managed this very nicely. So we can end with a note of gratitude to you and to everybody who came. So thanks all.